Okay, good morning and good afternoon. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It is our pleasure today to have Professor Muhammad Faruque to present a lecture to us on Ibn Arabi, Selfhood, and the Modern Meaning Crisis. Dr. Faruque is Associate Professor of Islamic Philosophy and Environmental Studies at the University of Cincinnati and Director of Academic Affairs at the Tokat Institute for Advanced Islamic Studies. He's also a scholar of Islamic studies and a prominent global philosopher who has lectured widely across North America, Europe, and Asia. His books and academic articles have been translated into numerous languages and have been recognized by important funding bodies across the United States, such as the Templeton Foundation and the US Department of Education. Professor Faruque's first book, Sculpting the Self, University of Michigan Press 2021, was awarded the World Prize for Book of the Year. It interrogates the question of what it means to be a human in a secular, post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic philosophical traditions, including modern philosophy and neuroscience. His forthcoming book, The Interconnected Universe, Sufism, Climate Change, and Ecological Living, develops a theory of the interconnected universe and argues that Sufi contemplative practices foster an ecological, sustainable way of life rooted in an anthropologic vision of self. Alongside serving as co-editor of the Studies of Islamic Thought book series, Brill, and also the journal Islamic Intellectual Traditions, also Brill, Dr. Faruque is currently working on several major projects. One of them is dedicated to AI and the existential threat of information technology, and the other is a contemporarily accessible introduction to the famous Afraid philosopher Mullah Sandra, Enlightened, Why Read Mullah Sandra Today, from Cambridge University Press. So, Dr. Faruque, it is my pleasure to ask you to please start when you're ready. Just for everyone else, Dr. Faruque will be speaking for 40 minutes, and there will be 20 minutes Q&A available after that. We won't be able to stay longer than that, as we often do, because Dr. Faruque is in the US and his time now is 11 p.m. We are lucky he's staying awake for us. So thank you so much again, Dr. Faruque. Please go ahead.
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Mr. Frank Joachim, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for attending this Zoom talk. I know it's quite early in Kashmir, but also you can imagine it's quite late for me, but we'll try our best to have a nice session and talk about some important matters. So yeah, let's begin. So I do have some slides to share, and so I'm going to share my screen and we begin the presentation. So I believe everybody can hear me well.
Yes, correct.
Wonderful. So as mentioned, the title of the talk is Ibn Arabi, Selfhood, and the Modern Meaning Crisis. And here is the kind of roadmap and what I hope to do. There are three parts. In the first part, I'll very briefly talk about the meaning crisis that's around, and then make a case that even in the second part, Ibn Arabi and what I call the anthropocosmic self, based on Sufi metaphysics, is a way to kind of deal with this crisis that we have now. And in the process, we'll see a kind of contemporary reconstruction of Ibn Arabi's teachings. So basically, it boils down to our contemporary situation and the meaning crisis that we are facing, and then whether Ibn Arabi has anything useful to kind of offer as we kind of think about a kind of way forward or kind of way out. So the summary part is very simple, but let's get into some of the details. So what is the meaning crisis? And why does it matter? I mean, it should be obvious, but we still need to explain some of these things. But here's one thing I want to also explain methodologically. So Mr. Nuralum and Mr. Joachim, they kindly explained to me that the audience here is mostly from philosophy, and they are scholars of Sufism, some of them at least, and others are more interested in Sufi practices and Sufism in general. So I don't want to get into kind of textual details of Ibn Arabi's passages. So I deliver a wide range of I deliver my talks to a wide range of audiences, and sometimes it involves very academically focused audience where we go through texts from whatever aspects of Islamic studies, Sufism we're talking about. Like if it's Ibn Arabi, we go through specific passages in the Futuhat or Fusus al-Hikam, and then discuss those. But that becomes, especially on Zoom, very demanding, because if you don't have a proper background in Ibn Arabi, Sufism, Arabic, Persian, it's very difficult. But it's still, in this talk, I do have one or two passages, but those are rather easy to deal with. But in other times, I do actually talk to audience who have absolutely no idea about what Sufism is. So it's kind of more general. So this talk will be kind of somewhere in between. And we are more interested in ideas, but it does not mean that I'm just saying things out of nowhere. There will be cases where I'll point to specific places in Ibn Arabi's text or in other or any reference that's relevant. But in general, my goal would be to explain things in a more general way, but at the same time be faithful to the tradition and the worldview of Ibn Arabi. So the reason why I'm taking some time to explain this is that I have delivered lectures to even a couple of Ibn Arabi Society people. Normally, it's kind of text-based, but I come from a more philosophy background, although I have training in textualist studies and all the languages and so forth. I'm more interested in also the contemporary applications, relevance of these ideas, and not just kind of their philological and historical meanings, which is important as a stepping stone, first point of entry, but I'm more interested in their contemporary application. So you can see this already from the topic and the way I'll be explaining things. All right. With that sort of introduction, let's explain what the meaning crisis is. So some of you might be familiar with the philosopher who is now around called John Vervaeke. He's a professor at the University of Toronto, but he has a robust online presence and talks about the meaning crisis. He's very popular with Silicon Valley people who kind of run the show when it comes to AI technology. Silicon Valley is a place. It's a kind of, in a way, metaphor, but basically in California, there are places where some of these people live. But anyway, when you say Silicon Valley, it has a specific connotation, the tech people, basically. So, but his ideas are also discussed he's widely popular if you just YouTube him. So someone like him and also others are kind of now talking about this meaning crisis, which is the idea that we don't understand what exactly we are living for, which should be obvious given that this is 21st century and we are so confident about our abilities. Elon Musk has these platforms and companies where he kind of delivers goods from from one planet to another almost. Or really, I think I visited a museum recently, and they were showing actually it is really the case. It's no longer DHL or FedEx, which made, and there are those companies which deliver goods from one part of the world to the other. But we have so much power, and they're constantly talking about settlement in other planets, Mars. So, and then there's all sorts of talk. So, like, we can do whatever you want. We can build a tunnel from connecting London to New York, underground tunnel, and then basically with 1 hour you can travel from London to New York. Those kind of things. So you wonder, I mean, people with so much, I mean, and they're also talking about replacing human beings soon, transhumanism. So with all that, rhetoric and bombastic talks, it's kind of, very surprising that the same people would talk something as quote unquote silly and romantic as the meaning crisis. But that's the reality, which shows that there is actually something terribly wrong with the modern psyche and the modern confidence about technology and computational power. So you can, spend just, good few hours talking about technology, computational power, and its impact on society, how it kind of transformed society in the last few decades or last few 100 years and so forth. But obviously, we don't need to do this here, except to kind of make the statement that despite all of this technological power, which in some cases real, in some other cases just rhetoric, because environmental crisis, climate change is a testimony to the kind of weakness of human beings, that there's a lot about nature, about the universe that we actually don't understand, don't know. And my talk is actually very relevant because I'm talking about the anthropocosmic self from the perspective of Sufism, Ibn Arabi. So these are not, this is still connected, although it seems like I'm touching a lot of different topics. So yeah, despite all of this technological power, it seems when it comes to deeper questions about how to live a good life and a wise life, we seem to be doing, and by we, I mean these technology people, we actually seem to be doing really, really bad. And so bad that people like Vervaeke are now talking about going back to Neoplatonism. And there are also some other people, I don't want to name, some of them are controversial. They're talking about going back to their past Western intellectual heritage to kind of to come up with new answers to these old questions. Of course, when it comes to Islam and Sufism, Ibn Arabi, the questions of the good life, what makes life worth living, these are kind of perennial questions everyone has to face. So yeah, that's in essence is the meaning crisis. We don't understand, despite our power, what exactly we are living for. From one point of view, it's easy to answer because we have progress in one sector of, you might say, human life, but there is tremendous kind of regress regress on other sectors of human life, such as, when it comes to important questions of like, who am I, who are we, where we came from, our origin, destiny. We have actually forgotten, and not only have we forgotten the most sophisticated answers, but because of over focus on technology, mechanization of human beings, we actually don't have any even basic good answers to what makes a human human. What is the self? What is the definition of the self? Which is the reason there are people now in the West, in the Western world, they're called scientists. They might have big university affiliations, degrees, but they're claiming things like, oh, consciousness is something created by electricity. And the definition of human being is simply a biological machine. I mean, if you can say that electricity is what ultimately creates all of these amazing ideas, thoughts, mysticism, science, human consciousness, why can't we go one step further and say the sewage, I'm sure if you go out of your house all over the world, I mean, there are places maybe sewage water is what creates ultimately consciousness. I mean, what prevents you saying that kind of thing? So yeah, So yeah, I mean, this is actually a tremendous, it's an amazing situation. You hear when it comes to the basic questions, so the human self, the what's called nafs in Arabic, or the definition of humanity, you hear such like really silly and ignorant answers. You really wonder what's happening to humanity. And of course, at the same time, the kind of the the kind of usual suspects, usual things that kind of make people forget about their true nature, like going for fame, success, has always been there, but today it's due to the ever present pop culture. It makes life even more complicated in the sense that at one point, when you are tired of living this kind of materialistic life, you often wonder what gives life meaning. And if also, of course, if your philosophy is only based on materialism, it's very difficult to answer the question of what is it that what does it mean to be fully human? What gives meaning to life? So yeah, when you formulate things, when you see things from the way I just explained, uh, you can then see that, oh, actually, Ibn Arabi and our Sufism actually has a lot to say about this. Because when you talk about Silicon Valley and latest technological developments, you might be wondering like what is the relevance of a 13th century Sufi thinker about this kind of fancy stuff. But the way you see, the way you're able to distinguish between what Sufis call appearance and reality, surah and ma'na, you can see that deep down we're actually going through a tremendous crisis. We are actually in a much worse situation than our ancestors in those times. So what does it mean to be fully human? We actually not only have we lost even the commonsensical answers, but words like goodness, wisdom do not even make sense to a lot of people, quote unquote intelligent people. Just to give a quick example, I just don't want to delay on this too much. I was listening to one of the world's most famous scientists, namely, Stephen Penrose. He was asked about goodness, if there's any meaning to goodness in human life, despite his quote unquote knowledge in physics and whatever. He just, gave astounding answers saying that, it doesn't have any meaning for him. So if that's what our technology and science are ultimately leading us to, that goodness do not even have a meaning, something as basic as goodness, then I mean, what's the point of human life at all? What's the point of democracy? What's the point of all of these values that people are shouting and doing all sorts of things about, saying all sorts of things around these values? So yeah, there's a tremendous crisis. So once we understand this, we realize that Ibn Arabi specifically has a lot to teach us. But let's also caution ourselves. Let's caution ourselves. It's not just going to be enough if we simply say to ourselves that, just by translating or explaining what we find in the Futuhat or Fusus, we'll be able to come up with answers. No, because our situation has changed. And there are a lot of new kind of impediments, new delusions, new obstacles. So simply coding Ibn Arabi would not do. That's why there's a need for kind of faithful, authentic reconstruction, making things relevant. In other words, what I'm trying to do here, and I have already published on these topics, like the anthropocosmic Sufism and the anthropocosmic self. If you are interested, you can just Google it. It's available. This chapter that I recently published, it's available on my website, also on academia, Sufism and the anthropocosmic self. But there are traces of this idea even in my book, Sculpting the Self, and also many recent articles. I talk about self from many different perspectives. So in order to solve the meaning crisis, my proposal here is that we need to revive ancient ideas about the self, about the essence of the human being, what makes him a human being, a proper human being. So Ibn Arabi talks about human beings, and as we know, if we have read Futuhat, the human being, human nature, self, in all sorts of ways. It's really very complicated. It's not simply a matter of the word nafs, which can be translated as self and soul, the word which is also found in the Quran. But as we know, there's another word like fitra, another Quranic word plays a very important role in Ibn Arabi. But beyond these words, he talks about something like al-insan al-adami, the Adamic man or Adamic human, or al-insan al-alam, which is difficult to translate, but very close to anthropocosmic, the universal, the world man, the man, the world man. For let's say it's not a good translation, but anyway, and other expressions like al-insan al-awwal fi kulli al-aqdam, the most ancient al-insan al-awwal, primordial human being. So you can see that, just looking at the words themselves, it's not easy to kind of come up with a kind of very simple definition of what is human nature, what is the self. But anyway, just to get into those details, it take us too far afield. So I want to present here kind of the more general idea about the self. So the self that can be described, that we find in Ibn Arabi's writings or in Sufi metaphysicians like him, is what I call the anthropocosmic self. So what is the kind of basic definition of an anthropocosmic self? First, let's explain this, and then I'll connect this with some other Sufi authors. And along the way, we'll understand quite a bit about how self is understood in Sufism, which is a very complex topic. And also toward the end, like, coming full circle, like shedding light on its contemporary relevance, like how it's able to give us some insights about resolving the meaning crisis. So the anthropocosmic self at the basic level is the idea that cosmos, the universe. Now, the word alam, again, if you just go back to the etymology, it's very interesting. And I just don't want to spend time on these things. You can just look at the details in my article. But if we're familiar with Ibn Arabi's writings, we know that words matter. You can't just translate any words. Ibn Arabi is very keen on finding the etymology, and the Arabic language is a maze. It's another world. So knowing the meanings of word and their semantic fields are also important. Anyway, the basic idea is that cosmos and self, alam and nafs, are not two separate realities, but rather two sides of the same coin, and a coin that reflects divine unity. Here, you might actually recall the very often cited verse in, at least by some Sufis, from the Quran, which says, "Sanurihim ayatina fil afaq wa fi anfusihim." We shall show them, sanurihim, our signs. Sanurihim ayatina fil afaq, on the horizons, fi anfusihim, in themselves. So you can already see in the Quran the idea of the seed of the anthropocosmic self, both the horizon, meaning obviously the universe. And again, when I say alam, when Sufis talk about alam, it does not mean just the physical universe. As you know, there are 5 divine presences, Hadarat al-Ilahiyya al-Khams, or different worlds like alam al-Khayal, alam al-Malakut, Jabarut, as you know in Sufi cosmology. So it means kind of other worlds, like the unseen worlds. So all of these worlds and the human soul together, they're forming the same coin, because divine unity, divine self-disclosure, tajalli of God is kind of reflected in both of these dimensions. And ultimately, there's a kind of profound interconnectedness. There's what I call organismic unity, which pervades all forms of existence. So they talk about Alam al-Kabir, Alam al-Saghir, as you know, in Sufism all the time, microcosm and macrocosm. Whereas in modern times, since Descartes, since Galileo's primary and secondary qualities distinction, we managed to see ourselves as, and also, of course, humanist authors, going back to Petrarch and other, and of course, thanks to Kant, Locke, Kant, and others, rise in individualism, we managed to see ourselves as separate from the cosmos. But if you go back to even pre-modern West, even the Renaissance West, this idea of organismic conception of the universe, of which human beings is a part, it's the norm. Today, it's the opposite for Western educated people, whether it's said to say in South Asia or America or Europe. We take ourselves as standing apart from the universe. And not only apart, but also kind of instinctive, not motivation, but kind of desire to kind of know the world, to kind of control and dominate. These are ideas going back to the so-called founding fathers of modern science. Anyway, from an Ibn Arabi's perspective, it's totally opposite. Because as Kunawi says famously, kullu shayin fihi kullu shay, everything is connected to everything else. This idea of interconnectedness, which is also the title of my forthcoming book, it's already accepted, and I kind of shed more light on the idea of the interconnected. But if you just pay attention to Sufi cosmology and the meanings of alam, and of course the self, you can see that this is intuitive. So in that kind of basic conception, the idea, the main conclusion is that the reality of the self is no longer located in the conventional eye, because ultimately the I is also the non-I. Some of these ideas are difficult, they require more explanations. But let's kind of proceed to the next slide and kind of see this from another perspective. So this is a model which I developed based on Shah Waliullah's writings, and I have another long article about this. It's called Sufism and Philosophy in Mughal, Safavid and Mughal India, Shah Waliullah and the end of self, on the end of, or end and the end of self, or something like that. Again, it's available on my website. So Shah Waliullah, as we know, was deeply influenced, and I don't need to introduce him here for this audience. He was Sufi Naqshbandi, and he was also deeply influenced by Ibn Arabi's thought. So he presents a kind of unique perspective on this, on the idea of the anthropocosmic self. So here is in this diagram, at the center lies the core of the self, constituted by our consciousness through what's called self-presence, hudur, such an important term in Sufism and Islamic philosophy. Excuse me. And then we have all the kind of human faculties, like aql, perception, agency, discernment. The word aql, as you know, has many different meanings and applications. Nafs, again, has many different meanings. So in this case, it represents the lower self, desire, appetite. And then qalb is the center, emotions, passions, from one perspective. And then ruh, spirit. But these are interpreted as lataif, subtle centers of consciousness, like the chakras in Hindu philosophy. I call them microcosmic lataif because there are macrocosmic lataif that corresponds to this individual microcosmic lataif, as you know. And then those macrocosmic lataif eventually are deeply enmeshed in the idea of wujud munbasit, the self-unfolding being, or nafasul rahman, a key concept, breath of the all-merciful, all-compassionate, or the universal soul from another perspective, which eventually is connected to absolute selfhood, divine self. So this is a model of the self in Shah Waliullah, and I guess it's kind of self-evident that why it should be called the anthropocosmic self, because where it's not just individualism, it's not the idea of individual with their own desires and self-contained, isolated in an island. No, like Kant or other philosophers who propose that kind of idea. Rather, the line which separates the self, the individual human being, and the world is very blurry. Yes, we can, human beings are given this idea, this capacity to reflect on themselves, to turn the self upon itself, to turn myself upon myself and kind of cogitate and think like Descartes, and eventually, say something like, "Oh, cogito ergo sum, I found the truth. My essence consists in thinking. I think, therefore I am." The famous. But we all know this. Look at all the critiques of Descartes from all quarters. That's just an illusion. And Yogi actually said, when I no longer think, I am, because it's the thinking that leads to kind of dualistic idea of subject and object. And ultimately, it's mind and matter dualism, and leading to all kinds of consequences up to the environmental crisis. I mean, this is it's a vast topic. I discuss this, so do other authors in some of my writings and also the forthcoming book. But not everybody is able to, those people who are simply bent on kind of AI and technology and transcending human weakness, quote unquote, they're not able to see this. They're not able to see that to dive deep into human beings. How can you even think about saying something like electricity creates consciousness? You can at best say from a secular, agnostic, atheistic, whatever perspective, that it's baffling. It's really difficult question. And mashallah, I mean, here, actually, if you go through Ibn Arabi's writings, even someone as famous as great as Ibn Arabi says things like the self is like an ocean without a shore. Like there's no beginning, there's no end. Yes, for everyday purposes, you can come up with an Aristotelian definition, which everybody in the Islamic intellectual tradition knew, like rational animal, nafs natiqa. Everybody knows that. But is that the reality of the self? You must be kidding. So anyway, nafs has also all of these other meanings pertaining to Islamic psychology and all that. So at this point, you can go actually one step further, and ask a deeper question. Like, how do we know that, like, if you want to play the role of a skeptic, how do we know that the self and the cosmos are one and the same, are two sides of the same coin? So again, I'm sorry to kind of ask, sorry to say that you need to read my article for a better response, because I just don't want to get into that specific details. But during the Q&A, we can come back to it. It's not like this idea is just a kind of figment of one's imagination. I'm just throwing it out to you, and no, there are many, many ways you can actually see that this is not just a question of intuition, but it makes sense from even from quote unquote scientific perspective. Think about the human body, because those of us who are familiar with wahdatul wujud, we know that from the perspective of the unity of being, even to talk about the self and the cosmos as separate is an illusion, because wahdatul wujud is pure unity, right? But then there is tajalli, there is multiplicity, and the unity in multiplicity, and the return of the soul through fana and baqa and all the spiritual exercises to ultimately plunge into that mystery of divine oneness. So, I mean, from that, if you are deeply versed in Sufi cosmology, Wahdul Wujud in particular, and also a practitioner of the Sufi path, I think this is intuitive. But those skeptics, you can still provide answers, especially through the human body. If you reflect on the breath, if we reflect on how the world is involved when our sensory modalities are active, when I see things, it's not just my eyes, it's the photons acting as stimuli. And then, when I breathe, how is this, how do I participate in the kind of overall scheme of life in the universe? There are many, many, ways you can kind of talk about that. All right. But just a quick word also before we go to the next part and the final part, actually, because I talked about the meaning crisis and I talked about the anthropocosmic self in some capacity. Of course, in a 40-minute talk, you cannot just exhaust all the details. But at least touching the key aspects like the organismic aspect, the interconnectedness. But if you want to approach things more philosophically, like bit by bit, premise by premise, I come from a pure, in a way, very philosophy background, but I'm also deeply, very, like immersed in the kind of world of Sufi metaphysics and spirituality. Because you can't say it's not just kind of theory, it has to involve both theory and practice. But anyway, from a more analytic perspective, I have a humble theory explained in detail in my book, what I call the spectrum theory of the self. Like how, because Ibn Arabi is talking, all the Sufis almost, they're talking about the self from so many different perspectives, right? Look at all of these terms, aql, nafs, qalb, all of this lataif, and then consciousness, and then macrocosmic lataif, and the universal soul, absolute selfhood. So, you need to understand them in terms of what Shah Waliullah and others like Mullah Sadra say, multidimensionality. So there's that theory, this is a concentric circle. It's like, the self is a concentric circle. You begin with your own individual consciousness, but which sometimes can be put in terms of what I call the biophysiological self, and then extend this to society, culture, sociocultural self, because the environment definitely has an impact on the way we construct our selfhood, we experience ourselves. Language plays a role. Anyway, and then phenomenology, and then of course ethics and spirituality. And then there's a distinction between descriptive and the normative. Anyway, these are getting really deep. But if you're interested and if you're asking for more analytical stuff, this is all explained in my book and also some of the more recent articles. So coming back to the more practical question now, once we have the intuition of the anthropocosmic self, as opposed to the self simply as a biological machine, simply as a machine, or simply as an after effect of electricity or the neurons, those kind of crazy and really ignorant ideas, honestly, at the end of the day. So we can, what can we really implement in our life from Ibn Arabi? So Ibn Arabi, like other Islamic thinkers, talk about the self, as I mentioned, from multiple perspectives. So the descriptive level is more like scientific and philosophical understanding. But there is also normative and practical aspect to the self, which is also needed because ultimately this is about self-realization. So, there's a kind of aspiration when it comes to the human beings, because when we reflect on our life, we are already moral, spiritual beings. We already categorize things as good and bad, good and evil. Things in the world that we should desire, other things in the world that we should not desire. Everybody, regardless of the religion, color, race, they do this, even though they don't have to be a philosopher. They don't have to know Sufism. They're doing this. It's except that, we who are kind of trained in philosophy, we can point out to their own thinking and life by kind of these categories. So there's a normative, like aspirational aspect to the study, which is in fact from a certain perspective more important. You have to see things not as an individual little ego here, self-contained, but as the anthropocosmic self, as the self which is multidimensional. It's not enough to just kind of, read Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which is a wonderful book, one of the greatest pieces of just Arabic literature itself, let alone the tremendous barakah, spiritual barakah and spiritual insights that you can gain from such books. So Ibn Arabi has a lot to kind of offer when it comes to kind of self-realization, knowing the anthropocosmic self, becoming this anthropocosmic self. But and of course, thanks to Ibn Arabi Society, thanks to all these scholars, there's obviously now a substantial amount of writing about the spiritual practices, about how when it comes to Ibn Arabi's writings, it's not just Sufi, it's not just metaphysics and philosophy, but also spirituality. It's kind of a mysticism as a way of life. You can't separate the two. So assuming that there are all of those practices and which are needed in order to understand the anthropocosmic self. Here are some of the characteristics, because those are the characteristics that we'd like to hopefully attain and implement in our lives. And with those insights and wisdom, we can hope to tackle the meaning crisis or other problems that we face in our own day and age. So this is a text from Futuhat. It says, quote, "They are the sages, people who have kind of realized, who have kind of realized the level of the anthropocosmic self on some level." By the way, I didn't mention al-insan al-kamil, or perfect human, which is another kind of term for the anthropocosmic self, because I'm trying to make sense things to a modern audience, obviously. But if you read Sufi texts and also my humble article, you'll see how the idea of the perfect human, al-insan al-kamil, is at the heart of the notion of the anthropocosmic self. Anyway, so focusing on this quote, Ibn al ʿArabi says, "They are the hukama, sages, who put things in their proper places and judge things accordingly. They put the secondary causes in their correct locations, while negating them in the places from which they should be negated. They violate nothing of what God has arranged in his creation, living it just as he has arranged it. Whatever is required for this world, they live for this world. And whatever is required for the next world, they live for the next world. They observe things with the same vision with which God observes things. They never mix up realities." End of quote. I mean, this is so important, especially the question of secondary causes, because oftentimes when people hear about Sufism, Sufi practices, Sufi mystics, they think it's kind of exotic stuff, and it's at the other end of the scientific, other end of what science tells us, what empirical realities tells us. But Ibn Arabi's perspective is a holistic one, and the perspective of the anthropocosmic self, which itself combines reason and imagination, as we know in Fususul Hikam, it talks about this, or of course Futuhat 2 and other places. For Ibn Arabi, in order to properly understand, experience the world, understand our own life, it's not enough to just rely on reason, only empirical science, but combine emotion and the imagination, and then see the world with two eyes, as he famously says, or see the world as God would see it. I mean, that's the goal ultimately. So this also means putting things in their proper places, not denying where scientific explanations give us kind of good knowledge. Like when something like COVID happens, I'm not just going to rely on some, mystical writings to figure out what's going on. I don't know. I don't know about the audience, but there's a reason why God has given us intelligence, which also has a computational and mathematical and quote unquote scientific dimension. So that should also have its place. So it's a holistic perspective, putting things in their proper places. That's the kind of essence of wisdom. And I mean, it's then become obvious. If we have wisdom, then should we then worry about meaning crisis? So Ibn Arabi also sheds light on, of course, his own spiritual journey and like what he was able to achieve in the end. This is a very, compact passage from the Futuhat where he explains how all the things that he has been witnessing, saying, talking, ultimately the whole journey was in him, he's saying in the first person, in myself, pointed to none but me, ilayya fiyya dalalati illa alayya. So this is amazing. Isn't that the essence of the anthropocosmic self? There's no distinction between I and non-I. Yes, it's multidimensional. For certain purposes, it's important to have a kind of definition of the self as an individual. Nobody should deny that on one level of reality. But the deepest level of reality is, in a way, the most, al-insan al-awwal fi kulli al-aqdam. It's without definition, because there's no kind of separation between the self and the cosmos or the divine reality at that level. the notion of individuality. It's also in Shah Waliullah. He says it in a even more clearly, saying when you kind of attain that level, all these all these ideas about identity and in modern terms like ethnicity and this and that, you don't negate them, but you see their relative weight. You don't take them as kind of absolute, truth, because your human essence for these mystics transcends all of these limited categories of race, culture, language, and whatever. So it's what Ibn al ʿArabi famously says, as some of us might know, maqam la maqam, station no station. Because at that level, our essence, and the essence in the sense of no definition, is identified with wujud itself, which is infinite, non-delimited. And the journey becomes kind of the goal at that level. The idea is to kind of manifest all the qualities of wujud, and it's infinite. That's why, ultimately, if you want to answer the question, who am I? What is the definition of human nature? What is the self? There's no fixed definition. And here, paradoxically, you come very close to postmodernism, which is weird, but only on this level, as far as this particular facet of Ibn al-Arabi's teachings is concerned, you might say. Like postmodernism also denies kind of fixed human essence and human nature, because that limits you, that leads to also social injustice and other things. But if the self has no fixed definition, it then acts like a mirror. And the mirror is it's an analogy, you see again and again in Ibn Arabi's writings. It's a profound analogy with respect to the anthropocosmic self. Just like in the mirror, where if you want, you can reflect almost anything. The color red, yellow, blue, the meaning of, I don't know, race, definition of this race, that race, this culture, that culture, just put it in front of the mirror, it'll reflect that. But is the mirror completely identified with what you're reflecting in front of it? No. It's only relatively true to say that the mirror is now reflecting particular color. Because in itself, the mirror is completely empty and completely full at the same time, just like ourselves. There's a famous hadith that says, I'm not quoting the Arabic here just to, I'm also running out of time. I'm just a few minutes. Neither my heaven nor my earth can contain me, but only the heart of my believer contains me. And this heart of the believer is deeper you go, it transcends all limited categories of language, culture, even Sufism. At the highest level, there is no definition, there is no boundary. That's why, like the mirror, it's completely empty and completely full at the same time. But from a certain perspective, you can still talk about what I call cosmic consciousness. Because we're living in a world, we're trying to make sense of what gives life meaning from the perspective of Sufism. But from the perspective of Sufism, in the sense of the anthropocosmic self, the goal is to kind of expand your notion of awareness, overcome all that kind of confines the self. Like what? Like egoism, like our selfish desires, like nepotism, like ethnocentrism, chauvinistic nationalism. All of these things, we just open the newspaper. We don't open the newspaper anymore. Just look at our cell phones and headlines. You can still see, despite quote unquote all the progress, people are quarreling about all sorts of things based on their national and ethnic identity and so forth. So this is a call not to overcome those qualities. If someone is from a given race, ethnicity, again, race is a complex term. That's a fact, but that's not the ultimate fact of human essence. That's the point here. And that's the subtle point that very few people are willing to explore, and not only willing to explore, but also has the desire to understand. And hence, we are kind of caught up in all kinds of useless quarrels from one perspective. So the goal is to kind of overcome this and integrate expanding circles of family, community, nation, world, cosmos, and beyond. It's like, the concentric circle that I showed earlier. Like we began with a notion of the self, and only a few people around us, our family, our own country, and its own history of a few hundred years matters. And perhaps most of us died that way, unfortunately. But then if we understand what's being discussed, we'll try to expand the notion of awareness, include other people, and not just other people, the world, the universe, and universes, not just this universe, and ultimately the beyond. And that itself is a worthy goal from Ibn al-Arabi's perspective that kind of gives life all the meaning. So it's not anthropocentrism, because oftentimes this focus on the human is misunderstood for some kind of humanism, especially Western Renaissance humanism, and the humanism, or this subjectivism that came out of eventually. I mean, with people like Nietzsche and others, and Foucault and Derrida and all of these people, or the individualism of Kant and others. So it's not a narrow focus on anthropocentrism. Rather, understanding that to define the self, to understand the self, it's a mistake to understand, to identify ourselves, our real essence, with this little I, the word I, man in nafs, ana in Arabic, man in Persian, and that we see all the time. That's a mistake. The sooner we are able to deconstruct that, we are able to see that God's signs are reflected both in ourselves and in the cosmos, and there's a profound relationship, interconnectedness between everything and everything. So let's kind of summarize. Sorry, I'm a few minutes over 40 minutes. It's just difficult when, talking about so many things at the same time, but, it's just one more slide. Because we started with the question of the meaning crisis, we have to come back to the meaningful life. So what I'm proposing ultimately is that in our own modern context, through all the challenges, specific challenges we as contemporary people face in different parts of the world, there are categories, there are realities that we have to consider that Ibn Arabi did not have to bother with in a way. But he would recognize, I think, he would agree. So for a meaningful life, in my humble estimation, it's a simplified picture. There are three essential components. We need to begin with material goods like health, education, and housing, the basic requirements in a way. And then also the social goods such as family, friends, relationship, meaningful work. Yes, meaningful work, not just any kind of work. But then beyond these two, because it's the next level, which is totally neglected by modern economic theories and political theories in a way, because people feel like, oh, you can simply figure things out about spirituality, and that's kind of personal. It's never personal, because the anthropocosmic self is the antithesis of individualism or anthropocentrism. So happiness, ultimate meaning in life, is impossible from an even Arabian perspective if it does not have the dimension of what I call spiritual goods, like prayer, self-knowledge, man arafa nafsah faqad arafa rabbah, contemplation, tafakkur, tadabbur, purification, tazkiyatun nafs, inwardness, to be able to see, discern the kind of meaning of things, not just surah, but ma'na. Therein lies the kind of holistic picture and the meaning of happiness. And happiness itself should not be identified with feeling, because from a Sufi perspective, it's the eternal happiness, that permanent happiness that matters, and that's characterized by self-knowledge and contentment. So all these things mean all these things. So in the conclusion, let me kind of just reiterate some of the things we've been discussing. Being a human, being a self, it's not a given, it's an achievement. And if meaning crisis is what is bothering a lot of people, then it's easy to see that in modern life, despite giving us a lot of kind of technological benefits and benefits in some some aspects of with respect to some aspects of with respect to our life, in many ways, in different ways. It makes harder when it comes to attaining the true meaning of being human. But being human does not simply mean relying on theoretical knowledge, scientific knowledge, simple definition of the human being. It's to embrace the anthropocosmic self, the idea of station and no station, multidimensionality, being able to embrace diversity and realize cosmic consciousness. And all these insights eventually allow us to kind of address all these issues of self-identity, choice, and consequences. And the question of only a success, quote unquote, materialistically defined successful life versus a more meaningful and spiritual understanding of human nature. So yeah, that's the conclusion. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to stop it here.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Faruque. You have talked a lot about what I believe is the most important thing, and that's who we are. And it's so important because we don't know who we are ultimately. And that's why it's essential. If you don't know who you are, then you don't know how to live. So this is fantastic. Are we still able to, Dr. Faruque, to still
Maybe
have
10
another
minutes?
10 to 15 minutes?
10,
Okay.
15 minutes, depending on the level,
Sure.
the kinds of
Once you
questions.
start to get sleepy, we will see that and we will remove
Yes,
you.
you can already see that, I'm kind of having this lapse from time to time.
Yes, that's okay. That's okay. No, it was still fantastic. You said all the important things. I'm going to make it available for comments and questions, but since I am the one who's talking right this moment, I may ask the first question, or if you like, it may be a comment. I don't know. Yeah, this self is something I've always been interested in for a long time, not only egoically, which that is also the case, but the thing I found about this self, you try and talk about something which is not fixed. We have 8 billion of us, and none of us are the same. Yet at the same time, we are the same human being. There are certain aspects of us which are exactly the same. There's no difference. But that we don't have to discuss as such because we all know that part. We all know that we breathe. We all know that we do the digesting of the food in the same way. Now, the part that is different is, I think, what is important for us, how I can know that difference in myself and what is my potential. Like you said, in Insan al-Kamil, obviously that's the potential that I'm capable of, but that's not where I am at the moment. And every other human being is also not there at the moment, but we are at different degrees. It could be, I don't know, from step 1 to step in Insan al-Kamil, it could be 10,000, 10 million steps, I don't know, maybe just 10. So we are at different levels or different degrees of this development. So we can't actually grab one and say, this is the human being. No, it depends on which of the levels you're talking about. So this is what I see is very important to bring in the picture because we're trying to talk about or learn or understand a moving target, as they say. If you can't go into the same river twice, because by the time you go in and out, the river has already moved on, and that's another river. So really, that I find is very important. Has that come across to you? How we can handle
Yes.
that? How we can handle this moving target that we're trying to understand, and how we can move up the ladder towards Insan al-Kamil to find our
Yes.
potential, not to compare with other people necessarily. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for those really insightful comments with which I completely agree. Yeah, Heraclitus famously said you can't step into the same river twice, but I think it was Heraclitus himself or some other philosopher later on who said you can't even step into the same river once, something like that, because because it's even more complex. But coming back to the question of diversity and not pinpointing and any particular definition, yeah, that was the point of station of no station, having no fixed definition. But then what is the way forward because then it becomes a kind of bewildering diversity. But for Ibn Arabi, there are actually some definite markers, you might say, some trustworthy exemplars of Insan al-Kamil or the anthropocosmic self, who are the prophets and the great sages. So he would put Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the top of the list, being a Muslim. But he is open to anybody, because this is not about just giving him it, because the idea, if we understand it from a metaphysical perspective, it's a potentiality of being an anthropocosmic cell lies with any human being, regardless of who they are, where they are, which age, time, doesn't really matter. So yeah. So, but if we have faith in at least some of these exemplars, then their life, their model is a kind of in a starting point, I might say. Then it becomes the question of creative interpretation of those teachings in one's own life, and that's not easy. I think that's where the challenge is.
Yeah.
It's not easy itself. It's not easy by any means to just fathom and really understand these metaphysical teaching. That itself requires a lot of effort, a lot of I would say good luck as well. One needs a really good teacher. It's not just a question of language itself. It's much deeper than that. There's a kind of, when it comes to Sufi teaching, I mean, I think one Sufi teacher, I mean, it could be apocryphal, but it brings out the juice of what they're trying to say, the essence. I think it was Bayezid who said, when arguing with a philosopher or person with a philosophical mind, saying that you guys take your teachings from people who are dead, like, you read Plato, Aristotle, who are no longer, but we take our teachings from those who are still alive. And this teaching comes from, in Sine be Sine, in Persian, there's a very nice heart to heart. There's a kind of direct transmission that happens, and that is supposed to kindle a light in the soul, and or kind of plant a seed in the soul, and that is supposed to grow and eventually sprout. So it takes a lot of courage, but the first step is motivation. And that's where these kind of discussions come in, I guess. And motivation itself comes from a sense of crisis, obviously. That's why even people like Vervaeke and a whole lot of others talking about the meaning crisis and recognizing that you don't have answers in AI and Silicon Valley and technologists. Those people know you have to go back to your sages, your philosophers. It's not a kind of scientific question. So, alhamdulillah, if someone comes from a Sufi Muslim background, it's not a given, that we understand these teachings, because we may be good practicing Muslim. That's good and that's fine on its own level. And from the perspective of Sharia, like that itself should be enough to kind of, lead people to their desired destination. In this case, let's say heaven. But then, as Shah Waliullah says, when talking about the Sharia and different meanings of the Sharia, there are also the kind of stages of mysteries. Let's put it this way: mysteries within human nature that can be realized through fana and baqa, in the Sufi states of annihilation and subsistence in the divine, and that those practices, those states can only come about if one is engaged in a Sufi path in an authentic way. And that itself gives the key to kind of answer life's biggest questions, like what makes my life meaningful. So those are kind of still first steps, but then there has to be what Sufis call tahqiq, our own verification and creative interpretation and application of them in our own life. But I think that it's very much possible, despite all the challenges that we face, to kind of resolve the meaning crisis by making use of teachings from the Sufi teachers, such as Ibn Arabi. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Faruque. All right. Anyone else like to make comment or have any questions? You can either just start talking, since there's not many of you jumping at once. Otherwise, I will request one at a time if you go together.
Yeah, I can ask a quick question if you like.
Yes, go ahead, please, Noor.
Yeah, many thanks, Dr. Faruque. Really, it's a wonderful topic. especially to understand the modern meaning crisis, and then understand the spiritual perspective, where they are coming from versus where Sufis are advocating. And the way you explained, they're saying that we are a biological machine which is separated from the universe, that's a clear idea where modern meaning is taking us, the individualism. The one you said, anthropocentrism, that's another idea which it's beautiful. And you said the mirror reflects, of course, is empty and completely full at the same time, because I have been seeing the mirror when I was a baby, and when I now old, I can see this mirror in my old self. So I am actually morphing from my childhood to my old age. This morphism happening in my biological part, but it doesn't capture how was my mind when I was little and when I was growing up. What are the other memory I build up in my, Karaban Khatibin has captured that kitab of what information is there about my mind, what was I thinking, how my love expressed in my young age versus my middle age and youth age, and now how it is. So there is no record of my emotion, no record of my imagination. So and how my knowledge database was built and built and built, and they just see AI of this database which human has put together. So this is really this anthropology. You taken this word anthropo, which is the study of human beings, and the ancient humanism, and then of course time and space, the universe, and how we are interconnected, and how this insanul awal is always present in the insanal al now, basically whatever insanal modern you can say, but it's always connected to its qidam, so it's not separated. So this is this hudus versus qidam. This connection is always there, and this really fascinating. And the way you explain the two sides of the self, the sanurihim ayatana fil afaq wa fi anfusihim. So this is the part, anfusihim part, everybody is ignoring, and I really fascinated the way you expressed our human condition, how kullu shay'in fihe kullu shay'in, that I am in the universe is in me, and versus I am in God and God is in me, and then this the definition of perfect human, what Ibn Arabi explained, and it's a new modern terminology you have given, anthropocosmic self. So this is really beautiful. So what I wanted to understand is this new idea, what this new scientist you are saying, Berkeley is saying that our consciousness is related to, the electricity, and which can be created by the sewage, or I didn't get that part. Can you explain what they are talking
Sure.
about?
Yes. So thanks for your comments. Yes. So no, on that specific point, it was not John Vervaeke who said that. It was another scientist, a biologist, perhaps I forgot his name, who claims that electricity is what creates human consciousness. So there is no mystery, there is no transcendence, there is no anthropocosmic self or anything that transcends materiality. In other words, it's just your neurons moving and other electrochemical activities within the brain. And ultimately, that is what gives rise to what you call consciousness self. So no mystery at all. So I'm saying if you can make that kind of, first of all, is it a scientific claim that we have to ask? Secondly, if you can make that kind of laughable, ridiculous claim, why can't you say that, why can't you go one step lower and say that it's sewage water that eventually creates human consciousness? I just said it. Yeah, I just make that claim up. So if that's the case, what's the meaning crisis? I mean, why do you care about sewage water ultimately? Why do you care about filth? I mean, why do you care about democracy? It's ultimately everything is coming from filth. You see, it's kind of self-defeating, this kind of progressivist, emergentist idea of, material things, matter giving rise to everything in the universe. It's a very simplistic way of kind of explaining things. I'm saying it doesn't matter. You can be an atheist and agnostic, but you can have more sophisticated responses. Like Thomas Nagel is an atheist, and he baffles at the phenomenon of human intelligence, morality, and aesthetics. These are very difficult to explain from a purely materialistic perspective. So let's just have some humility and keep quiet, and keep exploring rather than throwing out this kind of bombastic claims. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to explain.
Thank you, Dr. Faruque. Do we have time for one question before we close?
Frank, I would like to
sure,
ask
yes.
a couple of
Okay, thank you.
questions.
Thank you. Yes, Faris, please go ahead.
Frank,
It was Schwab. It was Schwab.
Shuaib, yeah,
Yes,
I see that, because Faris had his hand up. All right, Shuaib, you go ahead. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, doctor.
Alaikum salam.
I hope I find you well. I have a couple of two quick questions since in your book you have dealt with the idea of self very extensively. I just ran through your book recently. It's wonderful. I think it's a combination of both how Western philosophers have seen it, and then you're trying to combine it with more complex and sophisticated Eastern metaphysics. I have two quick questions. One is that how do you see self as in, because in the beginning of your lecture, you translated self as nafs, and I feel it generally translated as that. How do you see the distinction between the nafs and the ruh? Essentially, Sufis emphasizing that the similitude between the divine and the human realm is that of ruh, because that is what kind of signifies mystery. But at the same time, what returns to God? Ya ayyuhatun nafs mutmainna irji ila rabbika raziyatul marziya. It is the nafs that is returning. So how do you see that differentiation? It's not the ruh returning. I think there's a subtle difference, subtle technical point here, which I would like you to throw light on. Another, I'm really fascinated by your idea of anthropocosmic self, but don't you think it gets too close to a kind of a non-dual relational ontology or panentheism? Thank you.
Thank you. So it's difficult to answer both of these questions in a few minutes, but I think I have addressed them already, if not in the book and in other places. So first, as for the first question, it's a technical philological question. So if you delve into Islamic literatures from not just Sufi perspective, but also Kalam theology and falsafa Sufism, both early period and classical period and later period, you'd see that these terminologies, they have many different usage and meanings. Ghazali in the 11th century was already complaining that the word for soul, nafs, has so many meanings, and the word for and related words, qalb and also ruh also are complicated. He was complaining people are just using them in all sorts of ways. In the 18th century, Shah Waliullah is still writing about these terms, still repeating the same confusion in a way, saying that there is no kind of proper kind of clarification in Sufi writings about these things. So it's both the rhetoric, but also it hides a deeper truth. The deeper truth is that we're not talking about something like a material reality, something which is easy to get our hands on, like tree, like an inanimate object, like, I don't know, like a computer screen. You can break it apart. But we're dealing with our own subjectivity from a subjective perspective. But this subjectivity is not subjectivism. So it's like looking at a sphere or a spherical mirror. Just imagine that metaphor from multiple standpoints, each person looking at one angle, seeing the same different image. Or the parable of the elephant in the room with blind people. Everybody touching different parts of the self and kind of explaining it according to their own intelligence and knowledge and so forth. So nafs, in the diagram that I showed, has a different meaning with ruh as well. If you think about it as a lataif, as a faculty, then it simply means the higher aspect of qalb, and the relationship is also similar with respect to aql and sir. But ruh, in the sense of ar-ruh, in the sense where Salun in the verse, some verses of the Quran where Allah says, فَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, I breathe into him my spirit, or وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, they ask you about this. That's the spirit. That's different from just ruh. Ruh can simply mean, if you look at the classical Arabic dictionaries, it can also mean life, it can also mean self. And actually, if you can expand this analysis and look at similar terms in Hebrew, in Greek, you will see it's very interesting. Like these terms for nafs, like pusuche, punuma, those words in Greek, they also have those kind of overlapping meanings and so forth. So it hides a kind of deeper truth about the self. The fact that the self can be spoken in terms of different layers. So nafs, from one perspective, is the lowest level. But from another perspective, because I explained this in my book at one point, the fact that you can talk about it from so many perspectives does not mean that there are 10,000 different things. It's a spectrum. And I talked about it at length, just like light. Light is the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. As you know, gamma rays or radio waves are still, quote unquote light, but we don't see them. It's the spectrum. The self is a spectrum. You can put nafs, ruh, and then khafi, akhfa, and then aql on some level at different points in the spectrum, and go up to the universal soul and divine self. But from another perspective, it's just the nafs. It's just the self. So these are, it takes a lot of kind of readings into these literatures, and then people get used to them. That, oh, I see, I get it. It's one reality, but multidimensional and so on and so forth. So there is actually even no contradiction. The highest level of nafs corresponds to ruh, and that same nafs corresponds to al-nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil self. Because at that level, and especially Indian Sufis like Ashraf Ali Thanvi and others have explained, that's the highest level of the self, but corresponds to the level of spirit, level of ultimate peace, and tranquility, and so forth. So it's not like ruh is something different, from nafs at that level. It's not. So that's the first question. The second question was about, if I recall correctly, can you quickly remind me?
I mean, when the idea of anthropocosmic self, don't you think it gets close to non-dual
so it depends what you mean.
Or pantheism?
No, it's pantheism, panentheism. These are terms very difficult to kind of transpose into Islamic thought, and because these are terms with their own specific histories. Spinoza, and then later Hegel and others, like they have all sorts of debates about them. But the debates that wujudis and shuhudis and wahdat al-wujud and wahdat al-shuhud, people following these different trends, we're having at different levels. So first of all, I have problems with those terminologies. Secondly, dualism and non-dualism. Yes, from one perspective, it is non-dualism. It is overcoming your limited self. From another perspective, dualism is true because we live in the world where we live, where we experience duality on some level. So the anthropocosmic self, with its attendant ideas of multidimensionality, also gives us the insight that to be a self is to embrace contradictions, which is the deepest, most difficult thing to do on earth. From a religious perspective, people who are two fixed religious identities or secular identities understood in a kind of with religious zeal or fervor do the same thing. It's very difficult for them, those people, to see themselves from another standpoint, another completely different standpoint. Walt Whitman, the famous American poet, said, "Do I contradict myself?" I think, and then he said, "I do. And I do contradict myself," affirming that. To be a self is to ultimately, accept that, truth on some level. And the metaphysics of that is that when it comes to divine reality itself, there are names, everything ultimately in Ibn Arabi's context stem from divine names, right? There are names which signify names of beauty, but there are also names which are names of Jalal, like majesty. There are names like Ar-Rahman, but there are also names like Al-Muntaqim, and names like God is the harmer, harms people. So how do you reconcile that?
Al-Mudil.
Sorry, I think
Al-Qahhar, Al-Mudil.
Yes, not Al-Mudil, another, I don't recall, but, kind of not the kind of very opposite of being an Ar-Rahman, let's say. So the oppositions, no, Muntaqim is, not Muntaqim. Sorry?
Advar, you mean Advar?
Advar. Yes, that's the name. Not Muntaqim. Muntaqim is a different. Anyway, so how do you explain this? So it lies at the very root of divine, not divine nature in itself, because that divine self is infinite and beyond all these categories in a way, but a level below that, al-wahidiyya, not ahadiyya. And I know this is already too deep. So at that level, the names become kind of distinct. And that's, in a way, is the source of the oppositions that we ourselves identity conflicts that people experience. And for most people, this is very difficult to reconcile and accept and live with. But the anthropocosmic, the holistic perspective should give us at least some insights into that, hopefully.
Thank you, Doctor. I congratulate you on your book and wish you all the very success in the future ahead. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Faruque. We could never thank you enough. The only bad thing about you is that you're in America. You're not closer, so we can see you for 3 hours instead of just. Well, and thank you anyway for going way over the 1 hour that you allocated. So I hope you have a very good sleep. You certainly more than deserve it.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure we would love to have you again sometime in the future.
Inshallah,
Thank
it's
you
the
so
same.
much. We'll never thank you enough.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.